This is the supplementary Toad thought on Toad Wednesday in New York, Toad City. General thought about consciousness and psychology. When I was younger, I think one of my limiting features of being a young person, of having a young mind and thinking in young terms, was I had no real model for people thinking differently. Or I didn't even really know what that meant to think differently, to have a truly different psychology, what it meant to have a consciousness or a psychology that was completely distinct from my consciousness or my psychology, my point of view. And that is to say, I think that a point of view really arises from this unconscious assembly of modules, which is our self, our various forms of memory, our various response patterns, all that unconscious, pre-conscious, proto-conscious, consciousness shaping, meta-belief stuff creates something that we would call a psychology, what we would call a consciousness. And everybody has a different consciousness. I had no idea, I had no appreciation, or the barest understanding of what it might mean for someone to have a completely different consciousness than I did, or a completely different psychology. Truly reacting, feeling, emoting, responding to the world in a way that was, I wouldn't say completely rational, but very much part and parcel of being the owner of that psychology, being the possessor of and being possessed by that psychology. I was very naive. And I think the people around me were very naive because we were growing up in a very homogeneous, racially homogeneous, religiously homogeneous, worldview, politically homogeneous type of community where there was a great deal of agreement. There was very little disagreement, and I think there was very little capacity to even entertain disagreement or understand what disagreement might mean. Disagreement was perceived in very simple terms. Disagreement was probably either perceived as disloyalty, or disagreement was perceived as some kind of willful nonconformity. That was a sign that there was something basically wrong with someone if you weren't agreeing with this sort of common sense interpretation of a shared psychology, a shared form of consciousness. And then I went out into the world and I started exploring, and I'm really going far out of my normal grounds for understanding things, and coming into contact with people that had radically different interpretations and radically different psychologies that made perfect sense to them and made no sense to me. And it took me a long time to really begin to grasp what they might be seeing and what they might be internally putting together as their common sense reaction to the world around them, what they thought was the way to behave. And some of these were, I think, more advanced ways of thinking than the world I came from, and some were much less advanced. There are very important differences in maturity and depth, and just because someone has a very strongly formed psychology by no means means that psychology is a healthy or well-grounded psychology. Yes, there are a lot of very unhealthy, poorly grounded, confused, traumatized, manipulative, weird psychologies around that are results of very strange upbringings and very problematic upbringings. There are also very advanced psychologies, very evolved and mature and highly perceptive psychologies around. And the thing I found out was that, when you are sort of your psychology, or you are of your form of consciousness, that seems like the world to you. That just seems like that's the way it is to you. It is your sense of that's how it is, man. That's the way the world works. That's just the obvious nature of things. Unless, of course, you undergo one or two or three or four or whatever radical shifts or radical dislocations, which I did go through a number of very intense dislocations in what I thought was my common sense reading of reality. And I found myself thrown into other realities with other common senses and other consensus. And sometimes those were very advancing, and sometimes I was very aware of their limitation. But I think as I began to see the limitations and the narrownesses that existed as distinct from my own upbringing limitations and narrownesses, I really started getting a sense for what it might be to be limited or be narrow or be stuck in a certain point of view, which I never really understood when I was young. So I think you have to understand that getting around, having been around the block a few times, really gets you in a position where you start understanding this basic take that people that have lived in a very consistent world might not have, which is there is such a thing as a consciousness. There is such a thing as a psychology. There's such a thing as being locked into a viewpoint. There is such a thing as having a multiple viewpoint world, having been either by your choice or not by your choice put in situations where you had to adapt to other viewpoints, perhaps viewpoints that were dramatically in disagreement with your own. So I think we do have to think that we have to keep a model in mind that psychologies and consciousnesses are predisposing models that drive us to certain ways of seeing, hearing, feeling, thinking about the world. And it's kind of I think it's kind of a moment of epiphany when we really start getting that. We start that understanding, that kind of shock of understanding that, wait a minute, I've got a psychology, I've got a point of view, but my point of view has been very contingent on all this programming and upbringing and channeling that I've been slotted through as well. So I think when you do get that, when you get that sort of powerful moment of awakening, it's a very liberating kind of idea that that this is this constraining feature that every mind and every identity has, sort of either kind of going for it or going against it out there in the world. So play with that idea. I think that was a very interesting discovery for me.